Yo, Cubase Guy here. Hey, so I made a video a few months ago about crossovers on subwoofers and how to set it, how to make sure that you're setting your crossover correctly and in the right position. Somebody in that video said, okay, great. You did a great job explaining the crossover, but what do all the other controls on the back of my subwoofer do? Phase, auto mode, LFE, right and left. What are all those things? So I'm going to show you guys some different plate amplifiers, different subwoofers, and I'm going to go through and tell you exactly what those mean. You may know all this, but maybe you don't, so stick around and let's talk about it. All right, so we are inside my editing app. I'm going to show you guys some different plate amplifiers. I have 3 plate amps to show you guys. And as we move up in amp, we're going to go to ones more and more complex so you guys can see different types of amps and understand what they do. So this amplifier here is the most common you're going to see on today's subwoofer. So I'm going to maximize that for you guys so you guys can see. So let's go through what these knobs are. So you see a gain knob, a power light, a frequency knob, an auto switch, a phase switch, then you have your low level input outputs and then high level in and outputs too. So let's talk about what these are. So your gain knob, also known as a volume knob. In car audio, we have a head unit, right, which is your radio. And then let's say you have an amplifier in the back that has a gain knob. In car audio, you usually match the gain with the output voltage of your head unit. So it's not a volume knob necessarily as it is a voltage match in a sense, right? But in home audio, a little bit different. A lot of people use it for a volume knob. Your head unit in home theater is your receiver or your preprocessor. So when you turn the volume up on your receiver, or essentially your head unit, the volume on your subwoofer raises and goes down, right? So you usually set your gain at 12 o'clock or halfway. That's what you'll hear most people say in the home theater space. So this essentially is your volume knob slash gain match knob, right? But you use your receiver as the overall volume of the sub. So you can set that min to max wherever you like, but 12 is usually recommended. Your frequency knob is your crossover. So you'll see on this picture, it says 40 to 180 hertz. So you can choose your crossover point. In home theater, you want to maximize this. You want to turn it all the way to 180 hertz. That way, you allow your crossover on your receiver to do the work. You don't want 2 crossovers going. Let's say you set your plate amplifier to 80 hertz, but you also set your receiver to 80 hertz. Well, now you have 2 crossovers cutting off frequencies at 80 hertz, and it can cause you some big issues. So you usually want to set your crossover in one spot, which is generally the receiver. We'll talk about more of that in the next plate amp. So the auto is your on and off, right? So you can choose if you want your subwoofer to turn on automatically via a signal sense, or you can keep it off and just turn it on whenever you are ready to use it so that you're not using energy when it's in standby. Your phase switch here, this says reverse or normal. It's also called 0 or 180 degrees on some subwoofers. But this switch allows you to change your phase. You can change your polarity. So really quickly, if you have 2 subwoofers and they're both moving in and out at the same time, then they are in phase. But let's say you have one subwoofer in the back of the room and one subwoofer in the front, and they're both moving in the same direction. So they're both at 0 degrees or normal. They may cancel each other out depending on how you have things set up. But if I take this hand right here and I switch the phase switch to 180 or I change it to reverse, then now they start to move in opposite directions because I have flipped the polarity. I have flipped the phase. And sometimes this may be good because you want your speakers to work together, not canceling each other out. So if you have 2 speakers moving at the same time, you may be canceling out some frequencies. But if you move them at different times, then now you may have a little bit more output with your system. And that's what phase is all about. This one is just a switch, so you can play with it to see which gives you the most output. If you have one sub, you may not find any differences. So take a look at the low level inputs and outputs here. So you may notice that this plate amp doesn't have the what we call LFE, low frequency effects port, where you would typically plug your cable in. It has input R and L, left and right. So what do you do here if you only have one cable? Well, on this subwoofer, you can do 2 things. One, you can plug it to either the left or the right. It does not make a difference. Some people just plug it into the left. You only need one cord. But If you plug in two cords of the same signal, so let's say you have a Y splitter, so you're taking one signal and splitting it into two, you can get more output out of your sub. Remember, your head unit or receiver is your gain, it's your volume, right? And your amplifier is your gain. You can increase the voltage going to your subwoofer by creating two signals to one source. So if you get one cable and get a Y splitter, split it into two, you can plug it into both the left and the right, and it's sharing the same signal, but it's getting more voltage. In return, your amplifier will be a little bit louder because it has a boost in signal. So that's what the inputs are for this particular subamp. The output is if you want to daisy chain it. So you can take an identical subwoofer and take that same signal and daisy chain it to another one, meaning you can put them both together. So instead of running another cable from your receiver to your sub, you can just bridge them together with a cable from sub to sub. Now, this is also really good if you have one output on your receiver. Let's say you have a receiver that's a 5.1 system. You only have one subwoofer output, but you want two subs. If you have a plate amp like this, you can take the signal from the plate amp and send it to the other sub, even though you only have one output on your receiver. But now you have two outputs because of your plate amps. That's what that is for here. And then lastly, it says from amplifier to speakers. These are your high level inputs and outputs. Let's say you're using a stereo receiver that doesn't have a subwoofer output, or maybe you're using an older receiver that doesn't have a sub output, or just something that doesn't have a dedicated sub RCA. You can use speaker wire. So if I want to use my left and right speakers from a stereo amplifier, I will take a wire from my left speaker, my left channel, and take a wire from my right channel, and I will plug it into my subwoofer, and now it's getting high level input, meaning it's not just getting low bass, low frequency effects like in movies, it's getting all the ranges of audio between 40 and 180 hertz in this case. That's how high the subwoofer plays. So if you use high level inputs, you have to use high level outputs to your speakers if you want to. So the right side, two speakers, you're now going to take the wire from your plate amp to your speakers to get the high notes, right? The mid to high bass. So what's going on here is you're taking, again, the left speaker and right speaker from your receiver to your plate amplifier, and that's giving you a high level input. And then you take wire from your plate amp from the two speakers and taking it to your speakers to give your mid bass and your highs. So now your crossover works a little bit differently. So I said in home theater, when you have it plugged in with RCAs, you want to maximize the crossover to 180. You don't want to do that at high level. If you're using high level inputs, now you want to cross over the speakers differently. Now you're relying on the crossover in the plate amp. You're no longer relying on the crossover in your receiver. You use the knob on your plate amp to control the crossover now. So if you're using high level inputs, then you want to use the crossover on the plate amp. If you're using RCAs for a home theater application, then you want to use the crossover on your receiver. That's how you use this plate amp. Let's talk about the next one. All right, so now we are on to plate amp number 2. Similar controls, but we have some new things now. So we still have our gain, we still have our frequency, we still have a crossover, right? We still have our phase, normal or reverse, but look at the EQ section here. We now have something new. We didn't have this in the last amplifier. So you have frequency, bandwidth, and level. This allows us to kind of tailor our sound. We can now cut or boost frequencies depending on what effects we're trying to go for. So frequencies here is different than the frequencies on the right side. Let me go to a red, there we go. So frequencies here is different than frequencies here. So this one is still your crossover. You're still gonna set this on your receiver. But the frequencies here towards the middle, this one is now frequencies in which you want to change as far as volume level goes. So if you have frequencies, bandwidth, and level, let's say that you love rock and roll, but your subwoofer doesn't really have a lot of punch around the 60 hertz range. You can raise that if you like to. So what you would do here is you would set your frequency to 60, And then you're going to set your level to however many dBs you want to. So on the dB level, it has negative 14.5 up to plus 6, it looks like. So the higher you raise this knob, the louder 60 hertz becomes. But take a look at your bandwidth knob here. This one is called the Q factor. The Q factor changes how many other frequencies around the target frequency do you want to affect. So let's talk about like this. So let's say I have a flat line. This is no EQ added to my line. This is just a flat line, no adjustments. Let's say I want a boost at 60 hertz. So I go to my frequency, I set it to 60, then I go to my level and I start to turn the volume up to my liking. But let's say I only want to affect 60 hertz. I don't want to affect 50. I don't want to affect 70. That's what the bandwidth is for, or your Q factor. If I start to turn the Q factor up, what happens is I start to fine tune, I start to center in on 60 hertz. So if I have a flat line here, then I don't have any EQ at all. But if I have a bandwidth on, let's say my line was flat, but now it looks like this, and here's 60. Okay, so now I've raised 50 a little bit, I've raised 70 a little bit, but primarily 60 was raised. But let's say I don't want that. I want just 60. If you raise your bandwidth, then now you start to affect less frequencies around your target number. So now your line will look more like this. So now there's 60 hertz, and now you're only affecting what you're going after, which is 60. So the higher you turn your bandwidth up, or your Q factor, the more narrow you start to affect within the line of frequencies. The lower your bandwidth is, the more you start to affect the frequencies around it. So if you only want to tune a certain frequency, then you want to make sure your Q factor is higher so that you're only affecting the target number. If you keep it lower, then you're affecting multiple frequencies, which is also good. Let's say you like 20 hertz to 30 hertz being boosted. Well, you can select 20 hertz on your frequency, then turn the volume up to your liking, and then you can change your bandwidth. You can turn it all the way down so that it affects a number of frequencies around 20, not just 20. So that's kind of it in short. I do have some videos on that if you want to go more in depth, but that is the short version of it. And then take a look here at your inputs. We have something different going on here. On the last amplifier, I'll go back to the last amplifier. On the last amplifier, we had high level inputs and outputs, but we didn't have LFE. On this amplifier, we now have LFE mode. We have it right here. So this LFE is for receivers, home theater applications. Low frequency effects is what it stands for. This is what you're going to use if you're in home theater. You plug in one RCA from your receiver, you plug in one RCA to your sub, and you are done. This usually defeats the crossover built into your amplifier. So if you're going to be using a crossover on your subwoofer, you need to set it in your amplifier, because if you have it plugged in the LFE mode, then you're telling your amplifier, you're telling your sub that you don't need to use its internal crossover. You're going to use the one in your receiver. If you plug in the RCA left and right, then you're telling the amplifier that you're not using receiver and that the crossover built in can be used. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Even if you have a home theater amplifier, you can still use the left and the right. Let's say you have a splitter. You have an RCA from your subwoofer output of your receiver, and you're splitting that signal into two. You can still use the left and the right. You'll get a voltage increase. Your subwoofer will be a little bit louder than just using one, but you still want to raise your crossover all the way to 200 hertz so that you're still telling the sub that you're not going to use that crossover. You're going to use the one in your home theater. So the only reason why you use the LFE one is if you only have one subwoofer cable and you're using a receiver. If you're using a stereo amplifier, maybe you don't have, maybe you don't use home theater, maybe you don't watch movies, then you can use the left and the right. And even if you do watch movies on a receiver, you can still use the left and right. Just split your signal, plug it in left and right. They're both the same signal. Just raise your crossover on the amplifier so that you can still set it on your receiver. So that's what those inputs are for. There are no longer any high level inputs or outputs anymore. This is primarily a home theater sub is what you're telling it. So that's how you use this amplifier in short. Let's move to the very last one. So this amplifier is actually the one on my Rhythmic G25 HP. That's my $3,000 sub. So there's some cool controls on this thing. So this is more for the advanced people, those who have a high dollar sub. SVS subs have them, Paradigm subs have them, Rhythmic subs have them. All these higher end subs, Rail, they have these controls on here. So let's talk about these. So the first thing you're going to notice are the new types of inputs. We now have what we call XLR inputs and outputs. XLR are balanced cables. They are essentially microphone plugs. Have you ever seen a microphone plug that have 3 little prongs and you plug it in? Those are called XLR cables. They give you a balanced sound. They give you a lower noise floor, and they do better if you're going to string them across long runs. I use XLR cables everywhere in my home theater. So I'm using it right now on my subwoofer. So it still does the same thing as an RCA, it's just a different form of cable, maybe a little bit better. So that's what you have here. So source in is your input. You plug the XLR in. Your HPF out is what you can daisy chain to another sub just like you could in the other ones, right? You still have your RCAs here. You're never going to lose those. So I still have LFE in. And if you notice, I have LFE left and right. This is cool, right? So the left one is actually the LFE. So if I'm only using one cable, I'm going to plug it into the left or the white cable because that one is my dedicated LFE, meaning low frequency effects. If I'm using 2 cables for a stereo sound, then I'll want to plug it into both L and R. Then you have line in as well. So you can use 2 LFEs if you want to. Let's say you have a splitter again. You're shooting one signal from your receiver. You're splitting it into 2 to plug into your sub. Then you're going to plug it into LFE in left and right. Even if they're the same signal, you plug it into both. If you're just using line in, maybe you don't have dedicated subwoofer duties like the LFE, then you can plug in line in and get a high level signal or whatever you want to do and then set your crossover on the sub, just like we talked about in the last amplifier. Here we have your modes, your high pass filter, your master, or your slave. So this here, I have mine on master. I only have one G25 HP, so it's the only sub. It's not daisy chained, so it's not controlling another sub, so I don't need to put it in slave. And then I'm not using the high pass filter mode either. So I'm just using master because this is the only sub that I desire to control. You now have the limiter option here. Here is limiter. So what this allows you to do, I'm gonna try to see if I can't make this bigger for you guys. What are we doing? What are we doing here? There we go. So the limiter allows you to turn this on or off. Maybe you are somebody who listens to really low bass and you listen to it really loud. You can limit some of the frequencies to keep your sub from clipping. So if you're reaching unfathomable levels of audio, then you can keep your amplifier, your speakers protected by reaching a max signal before clipping. So let's say you have an issue with, bad clipping. You can smell the subwoofer. You can hear the motor going. It's too loud, essentially. But the limiter will stop the amplifier from increasing at its max level just before clipping so that you can protect your investment. So I have mine off because I don't get loud enough to reach my limits, but it's there in my protection. You also, again, have your power on, auto, or off. You now have an on mode here. This is dedicated on, stays on all the time. You can turn it off all the time, or you can leave it on auto sensing mode if you like to. So now you have your 12 volt DC trigger in. Let's say you want the sub to turn on and off with your receiver. So every time you turn off the receiver, it automatically turns off the sub. You can turn on the receiver, it automatically turns on the sub. So it sends a 12 volt signal to your sub to say, hey, I'm ready to turn on, let's go. Or as soon as you turn it off, hey, I'm ready to turn it off, shut it down. So you can plug this 12 volt trigger into your receiver or your preprocessor so that they both turn on and off at the same time. If you want to use this mode, then make sure that you turn on the power to on so that it automatically is controlled by the receiver instead of a signal or something like that. All right, we are still moving right along here. So the PEQ, parametric equalizer. So I have a switch on the back of my sub that allows me to again, EQ my subs. Just like the last sub here, was it this one? This sub also had a PEQ. That's what this section up here is. It's PEQ. This sub has the same thing, but just kind of laid out a little bit differently. So the PEQ switch is on or off. Do you want to use the internal EQ? Yes, turn it on. If you don't want to use the internal EQ, then turn it off. I actually have my EQ on my sub turned off because I use an external source, the mini DSP, as my EQ. So let's say I wanted to turn this on. Now I have some similar controls. There again, you see frequency, right? There's frequency, there's bandwidth, and then there's gain. So just like we mentioned before, if you want to kind of change the characteristics of some of the frequencies, you can. It works the same way on this sub. You can either increase a frequency by 3 dB, or you can decrease it all the way down to negative 12 dB. And then you can choose your bandwidth. How many frequencies around that note do you want to affect? And then you can choose the target frequency with the frequency knob. Now, if we continue to move from here, let's go down to delay. So you can add delay to the sub. Let's say you have multiple subs and they're not working together very well. You can add delay, also known as time aligning, so that you can make them work more together instead of canceling each other out. Maybe you have 5 subs in your room all the way around the room. It's very important to time align them so that they are working together and not against each other. I don't recommend using the plate amp to do it. I recommend using a DSP, like a mini DSP, for example, with Room EQ Wizard, so you can see in real time what's going on. Of course, you can change this knob and listen for some changes, but it's very difficult to get your delay correct if you're running to the knob, turning it, running and back to your seat and listening. You can do it maybe with a decibel meter, something like that, but it's easier to use a DSP in this case. But this allows you to add some time alignment to your subs if you like to. Let's finish off with the bottom here. So we have low pass, rumble filter, AVR 12, 80 Hz 24. Then we have some dampening things like this. All right, so this kind of gets confusing. So your low pass 50 Hz 24, AVR 12, 80 Hertz, what this means to you, it depends on how you plan to use your subwoofer. If you are going to use your subwoofer in a home theater application with an AVR, which means AV receiver, you're going to want to put it in AVR 12. AVR is the source that it's plugged up to, and then 12 is the frequency extension. So 12 Hertz is what my subwoofer is rated down to. So I want to get all the low bass that I can, so I want it set to AVR 12 mode. But if you're using it in pure 2-channel music, let's say you want to use this subwoofer in 2-channel mode only music, right? Then you want to use either 50 Hz 24 or 80 Hz 24. And what this means is if you're using large or small speakers, so let's say you're using large towers, you're running them in full range, well, you want to use 50 Hz 24, right? Or 80 Hz 24, depending on how large your speakers are. If you're going to set them to small, maybe use 50 Hz 24. This means that your subwoofer is not going to dig much lower than 24, but your main speakers are set to large, they're set to full range, right? You don't want to overload the room with bass, you want to keep it natural. You don't want the subwoofer to take away from the music. You want to use 50 Hz 24 or 80 Hz 24, depending on if your speakers are set to large or set to small, full range or not. So the other two modes, 50 and 80, are music modes. AVR 12 is if you're using it for a home theater application, which is what I'm using my sub for. The rumble filter here, you have on or off. If you remember what I said on this other sub here, I told you guys that there, actually, was it this one or is it this one? I can't remember. There is a limiter on this as well. So a limiter, like we said, actually it was this sub here. The limiter on this sub allowed you to protect your sub from clipping if you turned it up too loud. The same thing happens for your rumble filter. Let's say you're watching a movie with some serious infrasound. We're talking 10 Hertz, 9 Hertz at high volumes. The rumble filter puts protection on the sub and the amplifier if you're playing really low bass that causes the subwoofer to have no near maximum excursion, meaning it's moving at its maximum limits. You can set a rumble filter to make sure that the sub never moves past its mechanical limits, during infrasonic scenes. So if you're watching Interstellar and you guys know that scene that blows up a lot of subwoofers, you can put a rumble filter on your sub to protect your sub from over excursion. And you're gonna need that in Interstellar most likely. So I actually have my rumble filter off because again, I don't reach volume levels high enough to damage my sub, so I don't have mine on at all. But if you plan to play as loud as you can, as low as you can, you may want to consider a rumble filter to make sure that you're not playing too loud at those low infrasonic notes. Let's talk about damping last. So under extension filter, you have frequency and damping. So depending on how you plan to use your sub or how you tend to use your sub will decide which one's best for you. So in Rhythmic's mind, what this means to me is if you plan to play at the lowest frequency, so my sub goes down to 12 hertz. This is not my sub in this video, on this picture. My sub has different controls. Mine goes down to 12 hertz. So if I want it to go all the way down to 12 hertz, they recommend me that I use the high damping mode because if you're going to use it at high volumes, you need high damping. It gives you the cleanest sound is their idea. If you use low damping, it gives you a steeper roll off. So you can use that at 28 or 20, whatever you want to use. In my case, it's like 15 or something like that. But a low damping gives you a steeper roll off as you get towards the lower notes. And then your high damping is what you're going to use if you're planning on playing super low notes at high volumes. And then mid is kind of like the beauty between the two. So I leave mine on, I think mine's on high, and it's set to 12 hertz. So I'm getting all my extension and I'm getting the cleanest sound possible. So damping may mean something different depending on the speaker or the subwoofer, but in Rhythmic's terms, the damping decides how your system is going to sound. So for me, I'm using high. I have it set to, I think mine's set to 12 on my subwoofer, or maybe it is 14. But in short, that's how, oops, I didn't mean to close everything. That's how you use the subwoofer amp. I don't think there's anything else left in here. So that is a long version of how to read these subwoofer amps. I don't usually make videos this long, but I thought it would be really cool to talk to you guys about these subs. Maybe you have a high-end one and don't know what to do with it. It's your first time messing with one. Maybe you have a lower end and wondering, is it worth going to a higher end? What do you get when you spend more money? So hopefully this gives you a good idea of what these subs are all capable of and how to use your own. So that's a lot for me to remember. It wasn't scripted, so I probably said something backwards or wrong. So if you have any questions, leave me it down below in the comment section. I will get down there with you guys and talk about everything. A lot of you guys have way more knowledge and experience than I do, so please get down in the comment sections and answer any questions that you see. Give us some more advice. Whatever you guys have for us, we'll take it. So thank you so much for watching. If you made it this long, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already, and we will see you in the next video. K-Bass Guy out. Peace.